You're surrounded. The dust hasn't even settled, and the smell of smoke is already in your lungs. Your city's walls, those proud, towering defenses you thought would protect you forever, are nothing but broken stone and splinters. Out in the field, a sea of horsemen stretches to the horizon, their banners whipping in the wind, each one marked with a symbol that now means one thing: you're not getting out alive. But here's the thing, death might not be your biggest problem. Because if the Mongols decided not to kill you on the spot, what came next could be so creative, so methodical, and so utterly ruthless that you might actually start wishing they'd just ended it quickly. In this video, you're about to find out why surviving capture by the Mongols wasn't a victory, it was often just the beginning of something far worse. When the Mongol Empire began its meteoric rise in the early 13th century under Genghis Khan, it wasn't just their military skill that terrified people, it was their reputation. Villages didn't need to see a single rider to feel fear. Rumors traveled faster than their horses. And those rumors weren't exaggerated ghost stories. They were real accounts of towns erased from maps, survivors turned into walking warnings, and punishments that were so strategic in their cruelty they doubled as psychological warfare. Mongol warfare wasn't just about taking territory, it was about making resistance feel so hopeless that enemies surrendered before the first arrow was loosed. Which meant, when you were captured, what happened next wasn't just about you, it was about sending a message to everyone else who might even think about standing in their way. The Mongols understood something that dictators, conquerors, and movie villains have all known since. Terror works best when it's public. When a city refused to surrender, the aftermath wasn't hidden in a dungeon somewhere, it was staged like a theater performance. Survivors might be marched out to witness mass executions or left alive but mutilated, sent staggering to the next settlement as living proof of what defiance cost. One particularly chilling tactic, using prisoners as human shields in the next battle. Captives from one city would be tied together and driven toward the walls of another, forcing defenders to fire on their own kin if they wanted to resist. The message was clear. The Mongols could turn even your survival into a weapon against your own people. Now, this is where Mongol punishments stand out compared to other empires of the same era. They weren't chaotic acts of cruelty, they were calculated. A punishment was chosen not just for how much it hurt you, but for what it communicated to anyone watching. Some methods were so simple, yet so devastating, that they became part of Mongol legend. One example: death by trampling. Captives were laid flat on the ground, and horses would ride over them, not galloping wildly, but in controlled movements. The riders were careful not to crush the head right away. Instead, the slow grinding of hooves over ribs, arms, and legs would break the body piece by piece. In Mongol law, spilling royal blood was forbidden, so this method had an added political twist. If the victim was a noble, the Mongols could kill without shedding blood in the literal sense. The Mongols didn't just break your body, they broke your mind first. Before executions, captives might be starved, dehydrated, or forced to watch the torture of others. Sometimes they deliberately spare you from seeing what's about to happen to you, making you listen instead. The sound of horses stamping, ropes tightening, bones breaking, until your imagination filled in the details far worse than any reality. And for those they didn't kill, psychological trauma was the point. Some prisoners were deliberately released with facial disfigurements, ears cut off, noses sliced away, not only to mark them as defeated by the Mongols forever, but to ensure every time someone looked at them, they were reminded of the cost of resistance. The Mongols were nothing if not practical. A punishment often doubled as a way to serve the war effort. You might be captured and forced into labor immediately, digging trenches, building siege engines, or hauling supplies for the very army that destroyed your home. And if you collapsed from exhaustion, you'd be left where you fell, an example to the others. In the Mongol mindset, a corpse wasn't just a dead body, it was a tool, a warning sign, even a part of the landscape of fear they were building. One of their most famous non-lethal punishments was the strangling bowstring. Why? Because Mongol law and culture often prohibited the spilling of noble blood. Executing a high-ranking captive meant finding a method that left the skin unbroken. A bowstring, pulled tight around the neck until breathing stopped, did the job efficiently and silently. No blood, no mess, but the same result. Others weren't so lucky. Beatings with heavy sticks were common, and they weren't just a warm-up, they could be a death sentence. The Mongols didn't have to crush your skull to kill you. A few targeted blows to the ribs or back could leave you unable to breathe, or bleeding internally until you simply stopped moving. Sometimes, surviving wasn't even about physical punishment. It was about humiliation. A captured enemy commander might be paraded in front of his former troops, tied up, filthy, and beaten, forced to deliver a surrender message on behalf of his captors. It destroyed morale instantly, and when the Mongols were done using you as a pawn, they'd kill you anyway, erasing the last shred of your dignity. While the Mongols were known for efficiency in battle, their punishments could be drawn out when the situation called for maximum intimidation. One account describes captured rebels being sewn into fresh animal skins, often from oxen or horses, and left under the sun. As the hide dried, it would shrink, crushing the victim's body and cutting off circulation, until the skin and the human inside became one rigid mass. The symbolism was deliberate. You were literally consumed by the animals the Mongols relied on for conquest. The Mongols were masters of turning an enemy's beliefs into psychological weapons. If you came from a culture that believed mutilation prevented entry into the afterlife, the Mongols might make sure your body was desecrated in exactly that way, cutting tendons, removing body parts, or burning corpses to ash. It wasn't random cruelty, it was precision-targeted psychological warfare, and it worked. People who feared spiritual consequences as much as physical pain often surrendered without a fight rather than risk capture. One of the most ruthless ways the Mongols used captives was to turn them into unwilling participants in their next victory. Imagine this. You're captured after your city falls, bound in ropes alongside hundreds of other survivors, and marched to the walls of another city still holding out. The Mongols push you forward as the first line. Behind you, rows of archers, their bows drawn and ready. Above you, the defenders on the walls, staring down, realizing that to hit the Mongols, they'd have to shoot through their own people. Sometimes, the Mongols made the decision even harder. They'd put local nobles, priests, or family members at the very front. In sieges where defenders refused to surrender, this tactic was brutally effective. The choice wasn't between victory and defeat, it was between killing your own kin or opening your gates. If you were taken alive but not immediately killed, one of the simplest punishments was also one of the most devastating: slow starvation. The Mongols didn't waste resources on captives they had no use for. You might be thrown into a crude pen with dozens of others, given almost nothing to eat or drink. Guards might walk past eating their own rations, making sure you could see and smell every bite. Sometimes they didn't even bother to finish you off. Once you were too weak to stand, they'd leave you behind, knowing disease or scavengers would do the rest. This was psychological warfare too. Other prisoners saw your fate and understood exactly how quickly you could be discarded. If the Mongols could get work out of you before killing you, they would. Captives were often forced into the most dangerous tasks in a siege, pushing siege towers into place under enemy fire, carrying heavy supplies across rivers, or digging trenches within range of arrows. In many cases, these jobs weren't meant to be survivable. The Mongols treated you as expendable manpower. If you collapsed mid-task, you'd be left where you fell, and another prisoner would be forced to drag your body out of the way and keep working. For high-ranking captives, the Mongols often followed their own cultural prohibition against spilling noble blood. This led to some of the most unusual execution methods in history. The bowstring strangulation was the most famous, silent, efficient, and bloodless. But there were others, crushing under wooden beams or heavy doors, smothering under felt blankets until the victim suffocated, breaking the neck with a swift twist or a heavy stick. These weren't just practical, they were ceremonial. Killing a noble was never done casually. It was a deliberate act, performed in a way that allowed the Mongols to claim they had respected their own laws, even in conquest. Some captives were kept alive, not for labor, not for ransom, but simply to move. You'd be marched hundreds of miles into unfamiliar territory, often without proper clothing, food, or rest. The journey itself was the punishment. In harsh winters, the cold was as much an executioner as any Mongol soldier. Survivors of these marches told of frostbite so severe that fingers and toes blackened and fell off, long before the Mongols decided their prisoners had reached their destination. And sometimes there wasn't a destination. The journey would end in a remote place where the captives were simply abandoned too far from any settlement to survive. The Mongols understood that humiliation could be more damaging than physical pain. Prisoners, especially leaders, were sometimes stripped, bound, and forced to serve food or pour drinks for Mongol generals at victory feasts. Others were made to crawl on their hands and knees to beg for their lives, knowing full well they wouldn't be spared. In some cases, these public humiliations ended in immediate execution. In others, the victim was kept alive just long enough to be humiliated again in front of a new audience. One of the more unusual punishments described in chronicles was burial alive, but with a twist. Instead of a simple grave, captives might be buried standing up, with only their heads left above the ground. They'd be left there for hours or days, exposed to the elements, unable to move, as the sun burned their skin or the cold froze their faces. For anyone watching, it was a vivid warning: resist, and you too could become part of the battlefield itself. The Mongols were notorious for using biological warfare long before the term existed. In several sieges, they catapulted the corpses of plague victims over city walls. Sometimes, these corpses weren't strangers, they were captives. Prisoners too weak or wounded to be useful were left to die of disease, then turned into weapons. The defenders inside would recognize faces, adding horror to the already grim reality of the epidemic. This wasn't random cruelty, it was strategic. It combined psychological impact, public health devastation, and military advantage in one move. Occasionally, the Mongols did release captives, but not out of kindness. A survivor sent back to their city wasn't a gift, it was a warning. These released prisoners were often deliberately mutilated, missing noses, ears, or hands. In some cases, they were branded or tattooed with marks that identified them as Mongol captives. They became living propaganda, walking proof of what happened to those who resisted, and because they were marked, they could never fully return to their former lives. The punishment followed them everywhere. The Mongols were experts at learning the beliefs of the people they conquered and then weaponizing those beliefs. If they knew your culture considered a certain day sacred, they might schedule executions on that day. If they knew your people feared dying without burial, they might burn bodies or scatter remains, so no proper rites could be performed. This wasn't about random desecration, it was targeted psychological warfare designed to fracture morale at its deepest level. For some, the punishment wasn't a dramatic execution, it was a lifetime of servitude. Skilled captives, blacksmiths, carpenters, armorers were sometimes spared specifically to work for the Mongols, but spared didn't mean free. You could be relocated hundreds of miles from your home, forced to produce weapons and armor for the same army that destroyed your city. Your family might be split up and sent to different units or camps, making reunion impossible. For the Mongols, a living, skilled captive was an investment. For the captive, it was a slow, unending punishment. When the Mongols punished captives, it wasn't always done in secret. Often, they wanted a crowd. The larger the audience, the greater the psychological shockwave. In some cases, punishments took place in open fields outside the captured city, forcing survivors to gather and watch. Entire families were made to witness executions so that the image would burn into their memory for the rest of their lives. Mongol leaders understood that the fear of punishment was just as useful as the punishment itself. The more vivid the spectacle, the more likely that fear would spread ahead of them to the next target. One of the most infamous Mongol massacres happened in Nishapur, Persia, in 1221. After a Mongol commander was killed in battle, his widow, Turigane, demanded revenge. The Mongols besieged the city, captured it, and carried out mass executions. Some sources claim hundreds of thousands, though historical estimates vary. Survivors weren't simply left alone. In several accounts, those spared were subjected to public humiliation, forced labor, or relocation. Skilled workers were separated from their families and sent deep into Mongol-controlled territory, never to return. The city itself was razed, punishment extended to the land as much as to the people. The weather as an ally. The Mongols were masters of the steppe environment. They understood how to use weather against their captives. In the cold season, prisoners might be deliberately underdressed, exposed to freezing winds for hours before any physical punishment began. In the heat, captives could be left tied in the sun with no water until exhaustion set in, making whatever came next far more unbearable. Forcing prisoners to endure nature's extremes was efficient. It weakened them without spending a single arrow, and it made survivors dread the simplest elements of daily life. Capture didn't mean the same fate for everyone. Women and children were often spared immediate execution, but that didn't mean their future was merciful. Women could be forced into servitude, married off to Mongol warriors, or taken into the households of commanders as concubines. This wasn't random, it was a deliberate way to integrate the conquered into Mongol society and dilute resistance. Children, especially boys, might be trained as servants or future soldiers. In some cases, they were relocated so far from their homeland that returning was impossible. This separation from their culture was its own form of punishment, one that erased their former identity over time. If you were a craftsman, you were both valuable and trapped. Blacksmiths, weavers, and armorers were often kept alive, but your life wasn't your own. The Mongols moved skilled captives across the empire, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from home. You might end up in Karakoram, the Mongol capital, producing goods for a court you never chose to serve. Escape was nearly impossible, not just because of physical distance, but because you were surrounded by a population that spoke a language you didn't understand, under constant watch. The Mongols didn't always kill to dominate, they could also erase resistance by absorption. Entire groups of captives might be forced to settle within Mongol-controlled lands, intermarry with local populations, and serve in military units. This wasn't a kindness, it was a strategic move. By breaking apart communities and scattering survivors, the Mongols made it nearly impossible for former enemies to regroup and resist. You might live, but you would live as part of the system that had conquered you, stripped of any power to fight back. Sometimes, the Mongols punished entire cities in a single calculated act. After resistance, a city might be depopulated, with every inhabitant killed or enslaved, but in other cases, the Mongols would leave the city standing just not as it was. Walls could be torn down, gates burned, marketplaces dismantled. Survivors would be allowed to remain, but under direct Mongol oversight, their freedom of movement restricted, their leaders replaced by Mongol appointees. The city became a living monument to conquest, a daily reminder of what had happened and who was now in charge. Punishment wasn't always physical, it could be cultural. Religious sites might be destroyed, sacred texts burned, and local customs outlawed. Leaders and elders could be executed, not just to remove them from power, but to sever the cultural memory of resistance. For captives, this meant that survival could come at the cost of everything familiar. Your home might still stand, but your traditions, language, and leadership could vanish in a matter of weeks. The Mongols were patient in their cruelty. Sometimes they'd keep captives alive long enough to witness the destruction of their home or the death of loved ones, ensuring that their final days were filled with grief as well as fear. By the time a victim was executed, the Mongols had already taken what they needed: terror that could be used against others, labor for their war machine, or a demonstration of total control. What made Mongol punishment so effective was that it wasn't random brutality, it was part of a system. Every action had a purpose: to discourage resistance by making examples, to extract value from captives before killing them, to reshape populations into a form the Mongols could control. This combination of efficiency, adaptability, and psychological precision is why their empire grew so rapidly and why being captured by them almost never ended well. The Mongol legal code, often referred to as the Yasa, wasn't written down in a single, neat book, but it set the rules for the empire. It governed everything from trade to military discipline, and it dictated punishments. Under the Yasa, loyalty to the Khan came above all else. Defection, theft from the army, or even failing to carry out orders could mean death. For captives, this meant that your fate was tied not only to your actions, but also to the political needs of the moment. If your death served a purpose, whether as a message, a punishment, or an offering to morale, it would happen quickly. If your survival was useful, it would be on Mongol terms. Not every Mongol punishment ended in death, but that didn't mean you'd return to a normal life. Some captives were deliberately maimed, tendons in the legs cut so you could never walk normally again, hands or fingers removed so you couldn't fight or work. Facial disfigurement to mark you forever as a defeated enemy. In some regions, prisoners had hot iron applied to their skin, leaving permanent scars. This wasn't just to hurt, it was to label. You became a living warning sign, carrying the story of your capture everywhere you went. During the Mongol invasion of the Jin dynasty, the city of Kaifeng fell after a long siege. The Mongols didn't simply sack the city and move on. They took prisoners in large numbers, selecting the most skilled artisans for relocation. Many others were executed, and the rest forced to carry supplies to the next campaign. Historical records show that some captured officials were strangled with bowstrings, no blood spilled, while others were kept alive, specifically to help manage the city under Mongol oversight. The punishment was as much about reordering society as it was about vengeance. When the Mongols invaded the principalities of Rus in the 13th century, resistance often ended in complete destruction. In the sack of Ryazan in 1237, contemporary accounts describe mass killings, churches burned, and survivors taken away as slaves. Some were marched east, far into the steppe, never to return. Others were forced to serve in Mongol-led campaigns against neighboring states, effectively becoming soldiers for the same empire that had destroyed their homes. Surrendering could improve your odds, but it wasn't a guarantee of safety. If a city had resisted in the past, or if the Khan had issued an order for complete destruction, surrender came too late. In some cases, surrendering leaders were spared personally, but had to watch their people executed. In others, only certain groups like artisans or merchants were allowed to live, while the rest of the population was killed or enslaved. The lesson was clear. The Mongols valued usefulness over mercy. Mongol executions could be swift, but when the victim was important enough, the process became ceremonial. High-ranking prisoners might be forced to kneel in front of the Khan or his generals while their sentence was pronounced. If the execution involved strangulation, the bowstring would be drawn tight in front of the audience, the victim's face turning dark before they collapsed. The silence that followed was part of the point. Death without a drop of blood was as much a show of discipline as it was of power. Beyond killing and maiming, the Mongols often displaced entire communities. Moving populations served multiple purposes. It broke up potential resistance networks, it placed skilled labor where it was needed, and it repopulated areas loyal to the Mongols. For the people moved, it was a life sentence. You might never see your homeland again, and your children would grow up speaking a different language, living under a foreign culture. One of the reasons Mongol punishments were so effective is that they rarely needed to be repeated in the same place. Once a city witnessed the consequences of resistance, the memory lingered for generations. Chroniclers in Europe and the Middle East recorded stories of Mongol brutality that traveled far beyond the empire's borders. In many cases, towns surrendered at the first sight of Mongol riders, not because they had seen the punishments firsthand, but because they had heard enough to believe them. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had built not just a military system, but a psychological one. Punishments weren't isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a method designed to make resistance seem pointless. Captives were turned into tools of labor, of war, of fear. Those who survived bore the physical and emotional scars for life, and their stories became part of the Mongol arsenal, spreading terror without a single arrow being shot. The brutal truth is this: under Mongol rule, survival after capture was less about luck and more about your immediate value to the conquerors. A soldier, a craftsman, a noble, they each had different odds, but the same underlying risk. If you resisted, you risked death on the spot. If you surrendered, you might live but as a pawn in the Mongols' larger game. And if you were neither useful nor symbolic, you were expendable. Punishment wasn't an exception to the Mongol system, it was a feature of it. And for most people, surviving the initial battle only meant entering a slower, more controlled form of destruction. Captured by the Mongols, you wouldn't just be facing the loss of your freedom, you'd be facing a carefully engineered machine of intimidation, designed to break your body, erase your identity, and turn your very existence into a weapon against those you once called your own. And the most terrifying part? They didn't have to kill you to win, they just had to make you live on their terms.